Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. I'm joined now by Democrat Matt Engel, the director of the Lone Star Project, a Democratic Research and Communications PAC. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, I know things have been super busy, so let's just get straight to it.
Sure.
And I know you were closely watching the governor's State of the State address today. What stood out to you?
Well, what struck me was that the governor laid out a series of things that would really add up to his failures. Particularly interesting that he drew attention to the Child Protective Services, which is really one of his biggest failures. He took on that to fix just several months ago, and now has admitted defeat and turned it over to the legislature. And keep in mind that this problem at the Child Protective Services, where literally children have been abused and died, happened while he was an Attorney General, when should have been providing oversight and really some of the regulations that come into play with Child Protective Services. So it surprised me that he highlighted one of his biggest failures.
Do you think that, you know, in what he's saying and trying to give more funding, that there is going to be, and obviously we've already seen, a good bipartisan push to get these measures passed, though? Well,
it's only bipartisan because he's been forced into it. Remember that he didn't do a thing about Child Protective Services until the media detailed children dying. And there's another important thing. His Attorney General, Ken Paxton, right now is in court spending Texas taxpayers' money defending the system that resulted in those children dying. He should call on Paxton immediately to drop that lawsuit, stop spending taxpayer money defending a bad system, and use it to make the Child Protective Services better.
I also wanted to discuss, just because we heard state Democrats in their response to the governor's address criticizing Abbott for not denouncing some of the president's recent actions that have or could directly affect Texas. I'm sure you were critical of that as well, but just in terms of what we've seen, I mean, the proposed import tax, or at least the talk about an import tax on those Mexican goods and various things that could harm Texas or could potentially have an effect on Texas.
Well, it's extraordinary. The president proposed a 20% tax on goods coming from Mexico, which would be paid by Texas taxpayers. They say it'll cost Texas taxpayers about $16 billion. A $16 billion tax bite on Texans, and Greg Abbott didn't say a word. John Cornyn didn't say a word.
So you're calling on them to say something.
Absolutely. They should stand up and do something on behalf of the Texans. I mean, it was a straight kick in the teeth for Texas taxpayers, and a governor who said today that he hates taxes, that the only good tax is a dead tax. So he did nothing about killing.
I know we've been calling on them to get some response too, so we will continue doing that. What else are you guys keeping an eye on this session?
Well, we're going to pay close attention to what they do in terms of the budget and how they spend it and what the priorities are. It was extraordinary today that the governor called on fully funding the Texas Enterprise Fund, yet didn't talk much about education at all. I mean, he wants to put corporate welfare on hyperspeed, but is really slow about dealing with things like education and preparing Texas children so that they've got the opportunity to make a living going forward. And so I think we're going to try very hard to make sure he's held accountable for responsibly spending the budget and not using it, as he has in the past, to make sure that his own donors and his own cronies are taken care of.
Yeah, well, what about ethics reform and the calls for that, and obviously the legislation that failed last time around? I'm sure you'll be closely watching just how it's crafted, and, you know, we always say the devils are in the details.
Well, what's interesting to me, again, is that you've got a governor who's calling for an ethics package that does nothing about his Attorney General, who is under felony indictment. He hasn't said a word about Ken Paxton stepping down, or at least stepping away from enforcing the laws, yet he's calling for ethics reform. He really doesn't have any moral authority to push that, and I think that's one of the reasons that the legislature's ignored him.
I know we asked when some of that legislative package by senators was laid out last week, I believe, just on how one of the issues could relate to Ken Paxton, because it said if they are convicted, would have to step away from office.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting that we've got a situation in which you've got an Attorney General, the highest law enforcement official in the state of Texas, under indictment, and you've got an ethics package that could affect him, yet nobody's calling on him under those circumstances to actually step away.
I know you'll be continuing to watch it. We'll get you back in to talk more about these issues as the session. Thank you very much.
You bet.